Welcome to L&D Disrupt, the podcast dedicated to helping you overcome workplace challenges and prepare for the future of work today. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be speaking with the movers, shakers, and path breakers in L&D who are reshaping their organizations right now. Join us each week as we delve into the highs and lows of work in the industry to get to the real nitty-gritty stuff that you actually care about.
Thank you to everyone if you're just joining us. In this week's episode of L&D Disrupt Live, I'm pleased to say I'm joined by Crisostomo, who you might know as Carl Learns if you're already following him on LinkedIn. And really, we're going to be talking about how you can translate learning science and research into day-to-day L&D. So, Carl, the floor is yours. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and give us a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thanks for turning up, everyone. Hopefully this will be an insightful session. For me, I do a number of different things. I'm a learning architect, so I support organizations who are looking to select and bring on new learning technology or get more value out of their existing learning technology investments. My background for that comes from my time working at Cornerstone and Saba. I coach people one-to-one who want to improve their learning effectiveness. So I work with people to create a set of useful strategies, protocols, and tools for learning. And this could be someone who's going through a period of deep learning, say they're studying for an exam, or someone who has just joined a company and has got a huge amount to learn. So learning architect, I'm a coach. And in addition to that, I have a social channel called Carl Learns. I post videos on the subject of learning science. I've got a bit of a popular interview series on LinkedIn, which I speak to cognitive scientists, learning science translators, neuroscientists, and all kind of learning experts. And basically, I'm trying to unpack the science of learning and make it easy for people to understand.
Yeah, and those videos are great, aren't they? Like 5 minutes long, very focused, things you can just take away and apply from each conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that as I've got deeper into the science of learning, it can get quite complex and quite academic. So I think it's really, really important to kind of make things easy for people to access, and that's the whole premise behind Carl Learns. And I've called it Carl Learns, and that's because I'm constantly learning about the science of learning. So hopefully today, get some feedback from the audience, and it might send me down a rabbit hole of discovery if we pick up on something interesting for me to explore.
Cool. Yeah, feel free to send Carl in a rabbit hole in the chat. Feel free.
And today we're going to unpack the science of learning. We're going to see how it can be used by L&D to make learning more effective. And I'll share really what I've learned during my learning science learning journey. And hopefully I'll spark some curiosity, and hopefully everyone will go off and explore some of the concepts and protocols and tools that I'll talk about today.
Yeah. Cool. And really, I guess the show is going to fall into two halves. We're going to talk about how you can use neuroscience and learning science as you design L&D experiences, content, but also how you can best prepare your brain for learning effectively. So the first half, like I said, we'll talk about this design of learning and applying science. But give us a bit of an overview about how that works. What are the sort of key things people could learn when they're creating learning experiences from a scientific perspective?
Yeah, I think what the key thing is and the foundation is to use evidence and is to use research in order to be able to make decisions for learning design. And I think there are a number of concepts that have been really, really well researched, lots of peer review, lots of use out in organizations at the moment that really, really work, and kind of try to stick to a few of those to get started. So find a foundation. It's science, so experiment, see what works for your audience, see what works for the context, build a little bit more, and build some more. So yeah, find good evidence, find concepts and strategies. Some of the things I'll probably talk about today that have been really well researched, and then experiment, build, and start building out from there.
Yeah, Yeah, and I guess one thing I wanted to ask you about, speaking of research, is I was reading a great article from Andrew Huberman who was talking about how we can use exercises to improve things like our attention or our focus. So doing deep breathing exercises can increase alertness before we undertake some learning. Staring at a spot on the wall for 30 seconds can increase our ability to focus. So actually, it's the first port of call for L&D, maybe not to look at content, but look at exercises you add around how people learn, to kind of help people get in the right mindset, prime the brain to take on board what they're about to look at.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy you called out Andrew Huberman. And for those who don't know who he is, he has a very popular podcast, the Huberman Lab podcast, and he's a neuroscientist from Stanford University, and he is a fantastic science translator. So he's taking all of that academic research and making it really, really accessible for people. And the exercise that you mentioned, in terms of staring at the spot for 30 seconds, is really an excellent protocol to get you focused. Gary, I'm interested to know whether you tried it or not.
I did before this call, actually. So you can see I'm already in full flow. We're 8 minutes in and I'm flying, Carl. So obviously there is something in it.
Fantastic. Yeah, I've done it a number of times on a webinar. It's a bit more difficult to do on this particular podcast because I like to put a spot on a screen, something that's in someone's peripersonal space, and go through the exercise from there. But I could recommend people give that a particular exercise a try. And I think if we look at that, the first part of your question, should we include this kind of exercise in learning experiences that we create? And I think 100% yes. I think L&D has an obligation as part of the development process to give employees the best possible chance for success. Though I have spoken to a number of people who have included this type of content in their design. And I think one important factor, especially when first using something like this, say the staring at the spot exercise or a focus exercise, is to give the learner choice. I think we have to acknowledge that some people will turn around and say, what the F? You want me to stare at a spot for 30 seconds? Are you mad? So we need to acknowledge that. And I think we shouldn't really make an exercise like that a prerequisite of doing something else as part of the learning. Yeah, it's there as the flow, someone can engage with it, but I wouldn't make it something that is a gate, a doorway into doing something else in a course or in a resource. And I also think context is key. And I recently did an interview with Britt Andrietta. She's written lots of books on learning, and she does some fantastic work around learning science. I think she was the ex-CLO of LinkedIn Learning at one point. And within her Brain Awareness Manager courses, she actually calls out the fact that these courses have been designed with the brain in mind. So she's saying, you're experiencing this particular thing, and this thing has been designed with learning science. And she's saying, these courses are evidence-based in their construction. And she's saying to me that these courses are really, this kind of intervention within a course have been really well received by her target audience. So she's been quite brave. She's put it out there and said, there's evidence behind what I've created here. So yeah, she's not been shy about that.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. It's hard. You have to, I guess part of it is helping people see the value in it, because you often find when you get together in person and someone says, we're going to get up and shake our arms and do a few twists and things like that. There's probably a scientific reason for that. But like you said, most people are like, why are we doing this? And I guess if we're building it into learning experiences, you have to explain to people why this is going to be useful. And like you said, data can be a great piece of context for that. Just say, this is why this exercise is going to help you get more from the content you're about to engage with.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a good starting point. And I think there are multiple ways for L&D to bring learning science into their practice. Don't get too fixated by one approach. I think, as I said before, it is experimentation. Find something you think would work for a particular audience in a particular concept. It could be a strategy, it could be a tool. Make sure you've got that space to experiment as well. Do some good research. Make sure you get your head around that particular concept that you're using, because you might want to make sure that you're using it correctly as well. And I think you also learn from your experimentation, have some reflection, what worked and what didn't. As I said before, build small, bit more and a bit more, see what works for you and what works for your audience.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, I think that experimentation part is the most useful. Something else in the same piece from Andrew Huebner, and I'll include that in the post-show stuff, but he talks about how we can use random intermittent rewards as motivation during learning. He also talks about how we can use things like repetitions. I'm sure people have probably heard of these things before, like maybe gamification is something they've used, but is there a useful scientific sort of case study or rationale for why these are so helpful?
Yeah, I think there's lots of science behind lots of different things, and I think one of the best ways you can kind of experience this in action is through Duolingo. Actually, I think it's set the benchmark when it comes to designing a learning experience that incorporates the science of learning. For starters, they've got a whole team of learning scientists, 500 million people using that app. And they use learning science concepts such as retrieval practice. That's really at the core of what they do. There's some things around spaced repetition as well with their streaks. Everyone has experienced Duolingo and their streaks. And they use interleaving as well in the way they structure their questions. So if you really want to know more about the science of learning and you want to experience it, I would definitely give Duolingo a go. I know there's some very smart AI behind it, but the core learning science concepts can be applied in much more simplistic ways in your own design.
Yeah. I'm trying to learn Spanish at the moment, and Duolingo is great, especially for that repetition thing. So when a word is something in particular they want you to remember, they'll present it in 3 or 4 formats. And essentially it'll be like fill in the blank, speak the sentence back to us, translate this sentence, listen out for the missing word, and then that will be the word. So it really is quite useful. I wonder if you heard this thing, I think it's called like peak edge theory. And it's essentially when people go to events, they remember the most interesting part and the end of the event. And I'm kind of seeing this correlation with Duolingo, because the thing that I take away the most is that in the middle where they've really driven like a peak of interest or a repetition, that's the thing I'm taking away, and then the stuff that I remember at the end. So I guess, I will try and share some more resources on this, but I think it's quite useful for learning experiences as well. People can remember the big thing in the middle and the thing at the end.
Well, on that point of resources, I'll make a note of some of the things that I talk about today. I'll share those with you, Gary, so you can share them with your audience, but do share what you've learned, and we can I can maybe you can send me down a rabbit hole of discovery.
Yeah, definitely. I would be curious to know actually how many people have used Duolingo, and like to let us know in the chat, because it is really, and if you haven't, there is a free trial available of the premium version for 14 days, so you can go in and just get a feel for all that. But the random rewards are quite useful. It pops up and says, you've spent this many minutes learning, you've completed more hours than X people, you're on a something day streak. So really curious to see how many people have tested it out. I think as well on that point, we were talking about how you structure the content itself. And one thing you mentioned at the start of the show, you were helping a friend, I think. Well, you were talking about how you help people approach new roles, and you posted on LinkedIn about this recently. You were helping a friend learn how they learn to best approach the new role in an ability to take in the information. So I'd love to know like a bit about that process, and what did you learn and other people might benefit from hearing?
Yeah, so I had a friend who took a very senior role at a finance company, and as part of that role he needed to learn a lot of policy and strategy documents, and as he has worked through his career, that particular thing has been his real Achilles heel and has kind of held him back in previous roles. So what he wanted to do was be able to go into this new role and be able to kind of get his head around these strategy documents and these policy documents quite quickly. So I worked with him to set up some strategies, some protocols, and brought some tools into play as well for him to be able to kind of learn those things more effectively. So there were three things within there that are kind of interesting for the design of learning, and that was something we've just mentioned with Duolingo. That's retrieval practice. So what he would do with the strategy documents is he would just keep rereading them and rereading them, and he wasn't really, connecting those into long-term memory. So one of the techniques I got him to use was to, as he was going through the content, was to write questions. And he would write a whole bank of questions, and then a day later he would come back to those questions and try and answer those questions. So he was trying to retrieve what he'd learned from his memory, try to recall content. And then we used space practice. He was a big fan of chunking everything into 3 to 4 hour sessions. So he wouldn't do anything for ages, go really deep into 3 to 4 hour sessions of trying to get around this content. So we spaced stuff out over time. He did much smaller chunks of learning over a number of different days. And then we also introduced interleaving as well. So instead of just working on one policy document the whole time for a particular period of time, we'd interleave different policy documents or strategy documents, as long as they were connected in terms of subject matter, over the course of the time that he had set aside for learning. So we introduced those three concepts, and they're three really nice concepts to use in learning design. Now they're kind of the three bedrock different learning strategies that you can use. And so if you flip that, so I did that for him, but as a learning designer, if you want to use this kind of stuff, if we look at retrieval practice, that's all about recalling facts or concepts or events from memory. Now, we spoke about Duolingo, and they do this through their questioning. So retrieval practice is done through questions there. And I have to say, after being involved in countless compliance training courses, I've become a bit jaded with that kind of basic recall and comprehension questions. Asking someone a basic question after they've just read the answer seemed a bit patronizing. But now I know differently. It may seem like that, but it's also the first step in consolidating what you've learned into long-term memory. Asking questions that provide the right level of scaffolding and support as people progress that's a good instructional design skill. And then getting the right level of challenge is really, really important as well. So putting low stakes questions, for example, throughout content will really help people to understand the content better. So asking questions might seem obvious, but they are foundational. And I think the key really is to then layer up something like that foundational piece, with other strategies. And this is where things become really, really effective. So we take those questions, we know that they're the foundation. And then what do? Well, we space them out through space practice, which is another one of those strategies. So instead of cramming lots of learning into one day, you want to spread that learning out over time. And it seems that embedding new learning in long-term memory requires a kind of process of consolidation, in which the memory traces are then strengthened, given meaning, and connected to prior knowledge. And that process takes time. That might evolve over hours, may take several days. And sleep is a massive part of that as well. So the spacing itself, the right spacing, is complex. It's according to the context and the individual. But I quite like, there was a quote, I think it was in the Make It Stick book, that sums up the intervals quite nicely. You want to space them far enough apart that the practice doesn't seem like mindless repetition. But at a minimum, there's enough time that there's a little forgetting that's set in, begun to forget that content. So as a starting point, you could take those questions. You could use your learning management system to build multiple choice quizzes or scenarios dependent on the functionality of that learning management system, and space their delivery out over time.
Yeah, exactly. There's a scientific thing for that as well, isn't it? Because it's essentially your brain is only primed to learn for, I think, up to 90 minutes at a time, isn't it? So creating that space for people to actually do some meaningful learning rather than trying to cram it all in is essentially the scientific reason for that, isn't it?
Yeah, so that leads to that kind of, when are we best learning, when we're best at learning, when is our neuroplasticity at its peak, all kind of relates to ultradian cycles. And you may have heard of circadian rhythms. It's kind of 24-hour clock. Ultradian cycles work within that, and they're 90-minute cycles in which we are at a peak performance. So it really is dependent on when you wake up. It's usually, say if I wake up at 6:30, my ultradian cycle will kick in around the 9:30 time. And then for 90 minutes, I am at a peak. And within that 90 minutes, in 1 hour, my neuroplasticity is also at its peak. And it does, and then as that 90 minutes then tails off, our energy for that focus and concentration, which is, say, needed for that learning, wanes as well. But it doesn't go up and down throughout the day. You can explore maybe one bout of that in the morning. And if you're very good at this kind of focus and concentration cycling, then you might be able to do another one in the afternoon. Some people can go and do 3, but at the outset, you can maybe do 1, maybe 2 90-minute bouts of high performance learning during the day. You can learn other times, but you've got that 90-minute window. And that not just is relevant for learning. If I'm doing a complex piece of work, I try and be conscious of my ultradian cycles, but I have 2 very young kids who like to kick my ultradian cycle out.
Life gets in the way, doesn't it?
Very often, yeah. And with these things, they're great, but you've got to work with what's really good for you. So, but being conscious of it, I think, is really important.
Cool. Yeah, definitely. I agree. I'm reading the book at the moment called "Why Has Nobody Told Me This Before?" And it's kind of what we're doing now, but it's like a psychiatrist or therapist giving you tips that everyone can use from that world in your day-to-day life. And one of the things it says is essentially when we're in like a low mood, our brain will revert to doing the easy thing, like the thing we're familiar with. And essentially we're trying to build new pathways in the brain. And that's hard to do when we're fighting against all the stuff that's already established in our brain. So I think you're right. It's that all of these things we just spoke about tie into like giving us the best chance of building that new pathway as opposed to easily reverting to type.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know from the audience what they think of the idea of bringing in techniques such as giving advice around ultradian cycles, or it might be something like exercise, or the thing that we spoke about earlier in terms of staring at the spot on the screen. I think when you go to a conference or you go to a webinar where people are talking about the science of learning, you'll often hear a lot about retrieval practice, which I talked about, spaced practice, those kind of strategies. You very rarely hear about these the kind of the neurobiology, if you like, these kind of techniques that you can use to make learning more effective. And I'm interested to know from the audience whether people think that's a thing that L&D should be doing. Should there be a part of L&D that is giving advice to employees on how to be more effective at their learning beyond, say, the kind of strategies like spacing and interleaving?
Well, funny enough,
L&D would feel doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke at the start about being scientific and experimenting, and we often talk about not building on assumptions, but one thing you could test actually is that there could be no problem with the content you're sending to people. It could be all about timing, how well that person slept the night before, whether that person's doing the learning at the time of day that sets them up best to retain information. So it's certainly something to it, I would say. And we're going to touch on sort of these holistic parts of the brain and L&D in the second half. There's one thing I just wanted to pick up on a couple of questions, Carl, from the chat. To summarize this one from Sarah, essentially essentially when you're learning something difficult or uncomfortable or that causes discomfort, and it can feel like your brain is shutting down because it's quite intense. Is there anything we can do to combat that sensation, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's some of that is also the loss of focus as well. And, no one wants, if you're, especially if you're doing a piece of learning that you don't really want to do, distractions, procrastination, all of these things kick in. So I think it's around reclaiming that focus and getting focused. So there are some good techniques that can be used to get focused and then regain that focus as well. Some people practice meditation, non-sleep deep rest, nidra yoga. There's a number of different techniques that can be applied to regain that focus. So yeah, it's that battle that goes on in your head, especially if it's learning that you don't feel like doing that day or full stop, So yeah, it's trying to regain that focus. I think is really important.
Yeah, that non-sleep deep resting is really interesting. I was reading about that ahead of today as well, and it's essentially this idea that you just kind of give your brain a break, don't you? By not necessarily sleeping, but you could like lie down, take your eyes, I don't know, like just reset your brain a little bit. And sometimes that helps. I think sometimes maybe stepping away and giving yourself, like you said, that non-sleep deep rest between when you're doing something difficult. I think that would be potentially a useful tip as well.
Yeah, I think if you're working hard for those 90 minutes, so if you find yourself in that ultradian cycle, you're coming to the end of that, you need to come out of that. You can't just go stop. And so you need to get out of that focused mode and do something. The worst thing you can do is pick up your phone and kind of refocus on something else. A little technique, because I work a lot from home, that I use is that if I come out of that particular period, I'll go and start making lunch. I avoid doing a recipe. It's got to be, just doing stuff that is very natural, that comes very easy to me. And that helps me to kind of defocus after a very hard period of focusing.
Yeah, I can attest to that, because one of my worst habits is doing the Pomodoro technique. So I can focus for 30 to 40 minutes and then just picking up my phone. So it's like, it's not the Pomodoro technique, because I just swap one distraction for another and one screen for another. So I think sometimes that as well, get away from your desk. If you can get outside and get some fresh air, these are all things I've heard on podcasts to help actually cement that and change that behavior.
I think Barbara Oakley, who has done that, the big course on Coursera, and is one of the main people out there who talks about learning to learn. She talks about Pomodoro technique a lot. She recommends it a lot, and she recommends it as a way to get out of procrastination. I think she says procrastination is the enemy of good learning, and she recommends a Pomodoro technique to break down that procrastination. So I know some people use it. I use some other techniques.
Yeah. What's your sort of preferred technique, Carl, when you're trying to get the brain to focus? Would it be Pomodoro, or would it be something else you use?
Yeah, I don't use Pomodoro personally. The staring at the spot is a nice technique, but I actually use binaural beats. So these are, So, again, experimenting. There's white noise. There's lots of different things that help you get into that focused zone. But I just quite liked binaural beats, and it helps. I have a kind of headset here, which is what you want to listen to your binaural beats on. But I have that on when I'm learning, even if I'm reading a book, because I quite like the way it stops the distraction. So it's a good thing for me, having a kind of an audio technique. And what's great about binaural, so what they do, a bit of the mechanism behind binaural beats, is that they play at 40, it has to be at 40 hertz. That's the particular frequency that it needs to be played at. I use an app called Brainwave for this, and I listen to it for 5 minutes before. It's almost it's the warm up to that ultradian 90 minutes. And what it does, it plays a frequency in one ear at one So it might be a boom, 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 boom. And then in the other ear, it's doing, it's coming up with another frequency, so like ding, 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 ding. And so it's a bit like an illusion. But when the brain, I think the brain averages out this noise. And what it does, it then primes the brain for learning. It's great, it gets the brain ready for learning. And then because it gets you really focused. So I'm a big fan of using binaural beats as a way of getting in the focus mode.
Cool. Before we transition completely to this topic of how we prepare the brain, I just wanted to come back to a question earlier from Misha. It's about, obviously you work with a lot of organizations, so you're probably seeing groups of people at a time, but tips on giving psychological safety when you need to give new tools and techniques to groups of people, like the stuff we've talked about so far today.
Yeah, so it's a really, really interesting point. I think, most of my experience is one-to-one, and I'd have to say that I'm looking for the depth of what I give people is based really on their openness to some of these things. So I was talking to a university student, incredibly stuck in her ways the other day, and I couldn't get her to use something like binaural beats, or as much as I did with my friend Tom, where, I'd set up a whole set of strategies and protocols, and he's had a whole range of different tools. With the university student, it was just like, here's retrieval practice. This is what it's all about. This is why it's beneficial. Away you go. So I'm testing a person each time to know what's right for that particular individual. I've not done it on a large scale where I'm blind to a group of individuals, so I don't have any experience in that. But it is interesting, an interesting point that you raised around psychological safety.
Yeah, no, agreed. You mentioned something earlier, Carl, was about learning how to learn, and this ties into something you shared a video on recently, but cognitive flexibility. So kind of what is that in summary, and how important is it that we understand this concept of learning how to learn?
Yeah, so cognitive flexibility is a really, really interesting concept. And I interviewed a scientist from Cambridge University who's kind of leading the way. Trevor Robbins, his name was. It's kind of leading the way in the subject of cognitive flexibility, and the benefits it can give you and how you boost it, because you can test for it and you can boost it. And it's so important to the Singapore government that they've invested in this whole program. They see cognitive flexibility as key to creativity, to innovation, for Singapore to become a successful country. So they've invested in a program that they're rolling out. Well, they're experimenting, they're researching, and then they're rolling out within the country. And within that point around learning to learn is really important. I would say the thing that, when I look back on my learning science journey, the thing I wish I'd conned on to a little bit earlier on is the kind of the subject of learning to learn, learning how to learn, how to be a more effective learner. Because I think in understanding that and feeling that, going through that experience of trying all of these techniques out on myself, I would have learned much more quickly. And I think it's the first step you should do when you're stepping into the world of learning science. And I think it's really important for anyone who works in L&D. They should have a good understanding of how to learn. And, I think when I look back on it, I think it gave me an understanding of how much effort is required to learn something, how counterintuitive a lot of these evidence-based approaches are. So as a learning professional, I think it's really beneficial. I think it gives you empathy, so you kind of understand the strategies and challenges of learning. You can better empathize with your learners when you're designing training programs. I think it's important to learn just for a professional development perspective. If you stay current, you stay relevant in your field, you may even be taken a bit more seriously. You're practicing what you preach. I think it's important to lead by example. and to demonstrate the importance of continuous learning. Learning to learn is a great way to do that. And really, really importantly, it made learning fun, and it made learning a lot easier. So I started out just at the beginning of when I was learning to learn on a neuroscience course. And within that course, it said it would be great if you had an understanding of electrical engineering and complex math problem solving. And a few years ago, that would have just shut me down. I would have not really been interested in getting involved in this course. But I knew I had a kit bag of techniques and strategies that I could lean on as I went through this course. And it wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. And it was a great learning experience, and it was actually really good fun. So I think, I think L&D has a critical role in helping organisations and individuals hit their full potential. And I think having a strong understanding of learning to learn will allow you to design much more effective training programs. You stay current and you lead by example, and you actually really enjoy the learning that you're doing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was recently writing something about upskilling, and I realized that it kind of reinforced this need that we need to learn how to learn, because people were talking about upskilling like it was this finite thing, like, well, you've got to close the digital skills gap, or we've got more people working remotely. But it's not like you get to that and then you won't need to upskill again. So it's far more important to learn how you build new skills for challenges at hand, rather than to build skills for a particular challenge, because there's always going to be another stimulus or reason that you need to learn a new set of skills, isn't it? So that is probably more important than just learning skills for a particular challenge. It's how am I going to learn so I can learn forever, basically.
Yeah, I think someone put it really nicely. They said that it's like your mobile phone. Instead of keep trying to learn the apps, why don't you learn the operating system? And that's it in a nutshell. Essentially, you're trying to learn the operating system. So yeah, it's great. It's been really helpful for me in my own learning and also in my practice.
Yeah. I've got another question in the chat, actually, Carl, from Vinny, who's saying, why is self-awareness sometimes interpreted by our brain as a threat? So I've been trying to do this myself, is build more self-awareness over time. But I guess it's like there's sometimes this initial pushback, isn't it? Because you don't want to sometimes accept that you're wrong. Is it just that? I don't know what it is.
Yeah, so in terms of, well, could you, contextualize that a little bit?
Yeah. So maybe, Vinny, if you can give us a bit more context in the chat, if there's any particular angle you're trying to tackle, or if there's anything more you can add to the question, that would be great. In the short term, Carl, we spoke about this holistic thing. We wanted to speak about a few things like exercise, sleep, diet. I think sleep is a good one to pick up on, because you mentioned this earlier, and I've got a really succinct quote that I found on this from Matthew Walker, who wrote that very popular book, Why We Sleep. He said that we've learned that sleep before learning helps prepare your brain for the initial formation of memories, and then sleep after learning is essential to help save and cement that new information into the architecture of the brain, meaning that you're less likely to forget it. So, I guess we spoke about, like, can L&D teams actually play a role in helping people get better sleep? Just how important is sleep on the brain as we try to learn?
Yeah. No, it's incredibly important. I think it's the single most important thing when it comes to learning, and that is sleep. When we sleep, there's that memory consolidation happens, as you just mentioned. Your brain consolidates and strengthens memories, making it easier for you to recall what you've learned, and it promotes brain plasticity, which is the ability for the brain's ability to change and adapt to new information. So when sleep, the brain rewires neural connections, which allows you to learn information more effectively. So, for example, that space, the most impressive thing about spacing out your practice is the sleep you get in between each of those bouts of learning. That's why, really, when you look at space practice, people often talk about Ebbinghaus and the forgetting curve theory, but realistically, it's the sleep that you get between those bouts of learning, between those spaces, which is really, really important. And if you're having trouble sleeping, I think a good place to turn is to some sleep toolkits. Going back to Andrew Huberman, he talks a lot about sleep and how to get better sleep. And he's devised a really, really good sleep toolkit. And there's a number of different things that you can do on there in order to improve your sleep, in order to be ready to learn, and in order to kind of consolidate what you've learned when you're sleeping as well. So I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, what's fascinating about that is so little of that has anything to do with what we do before we go to bed. So the best way to deal with the sleep toolkit, I think he shared a really concise version of it on his Instagram, but it's like within the first 2 hours of waking, like get some exercise in within the first hour, natural sunlight. I can't remember what the other parts are, but it's like that thing you think, well, it's everything I do before I go to sleep is going to give me the best chance of getting good sleep. But actually, it's the stuff you do at the start of the day. So, yeah, it's fascinating, really.
Yeah, and it goes back to the circadian rhythms, which are the cycles which I talked about earlier. And he talks about that lot. So again, some of these things will work for you, some of you won't. And trying to get light into my eyes within an hour of waking up is difficult, though the exercise bit I can do within 2 hours. So I've made some space to be able to do that. So yeah, and he talks about some supplements and a whole range of different things. Some of the things are quite obvious, like coffee and screen time, avoiding screen time before bed. Don't drink coffee X amount of hours before you sleep. So I think, some of these things you can weave into your day-to-day. And some of these things, if you're like, right, I'm going to go through a period of really deep learning, I'm going to try and apply a number of these things as best as I can to get the best possible sleep and to be focused when I go into my sleep and to get that stuff to consolidate when I am asleep.
And in terms of L&D's role, we sort of talked a bit about like nudging people, giving them the choice or trying to just communicate the value. But do you think it's kind of overstepping the mark a little bit if we try and give people content about how to sleep better? Because like we said earlier, some people might have kids that are disrupting the circadian rhythm and so on. But yeah, what do you think as an L&D team? What's this friendly balance that doesn't feel too pushy, but also is like, this is going to help you kind of thing?
Yeah, I think an interesting thing to do is probably work with well-being within an organisation, because there is an overlap here where some of this really kind of falls into the area. It depends on the size of your organisation, but falls into the area of well-being. And it may be that you find that talking to the organisation about this hand in hand with well-being, with health and well-being people of the organisation, or however it's kind of labelled in your company, is a good way to go to market, because there's it's coming from a part of the business where that kind of language may often be spoken in your organisation, again, depending on what their role is. So that might be a good way forward. And that might be something around that. I'm just thinking that psychological safety. Yeah, it may be good to talk that through health and wellbeing, because they're often rolling out initiatives which are of a similar type, So
yeah, it could just be a repackaging of stuff you already offer. Like, for example, if you already subsidize gym memberships, rather than just pitching it as an employee benefit, tie it into this could help you perform better. If you're already doing flexible hours and it's allowing people to sleep more on their natural sleep cycle and things like that, there's possibly ways you could just rebrand and repackage what you already offer to people, but with like an L&D or well-being spin. So I think that's a useful thing to keep in mind. Another question in the chat, Carl, about micro-learning. Obviously, it's like one of the most popular, commonly used words when we talk about types of content, designing content. But yeah, just how useful is it to help us learn effectively?
Yeah, I think as a thing, why it's useful is that you're chunking down content. And I think this is where we kind of look at our cognitive load and what we can take in at any one particular time, because, our working memory has its limits, and we need to be conscious of that. And we don't want to overload our brains with too much content. And then I think that's where microlearning is kind of, so there is some science behind it, this idea of chunking content down, and now it's kind of manifested itself as as micro learning. So it's good, learning in small chunks, spacing those chunks out over time is definitely a good thing.
Just curious, actually, it's not something we spoke about before, but when you go into organizations and you kind of sit down with them to review what they're doing, are there any common themes that come up or quick wins you find people can apply, or, common pieces of advice you give to people? Because I think that could be quite useful for people to hear.
Yeah, I would, apart from getting them to learn a bit about learning, I always, learn a bit about learning to learn. I often point them into in the direction of Barbara Oakley's course on Coursera. So that's a really good starting point. And then the usual kind of beginning of advice is to get people to just get their head around a few concepts. It may be just retrieval practice, and it may be just space practice, and see how they differ from the way that they do things currently, and go and explore those two concepts. That's always a great starting point. It's dependent on the type of organization they come up and speak to. There's lots of different themes that come out. I think often when I start talking about some of the more detailed things, people do say, well, this is counterintuitive. This is taking longer. It's going to take more time. I've got pressures. I need to deliver this course within a particular time frame. I can't do that to this particular. It's not going to work. So I think you need to pick your battles wisely. If you're going to bring some learning science into a particular program, make sure you've got the space to be able to do that, the space to experiment. Make sure you work with your kind of subject matter experts to tell them this is what you're going to be doing. I think I suppose the common theme is, well, this is going to take longer, and some of this stuff's a bit counterintuitive, and trying to deal with that friction there.
Well, yeah, I think it's winning people over, I guess, is your biggest challenge. Can you remind us again the name of the course on Coursera, Carl? And we can put it in the show notes as well, but just in case people want to go and check it out today.
Yeah, I think it's from memory. I think it's learning how to learn, or learn how to learn. Barbara Oakley Coursera.
Cool.
If you pop that into Google, it will pop up, and get stuff.
We'll track down the full link, the proper. We'll send it to people. But yeah, it's interesting. I've not heard of that one before, so I'll have to check it out myself. One of the things that frightened me most on one of your videos, Carl, is that a poor diet over time can reduce the plasticity of our brain. And that makes it difficult for us, our ability to change and to adapt to new stimulus. And I haven't eaten a vegetable in like 30 years. So I've been trying to offset it with the athletic greens recently, but I'm worried about the long-term power of my brain. But yeah, how exactly does diet feed into our ability to learn? And again, it's like, we're just talking about the same concept of whether L&D teams can give this advice to people and what's too far. But just tell us, I guess, the science of that.
Yeah, I would say, and this is from my own kind of research, that there's not a lot to really build upon that says you need to eat X and Y. I don't think there's strong enough science out there but people do talk about nuts and oily fish and these various different things. But I think it's really a case of what not to eat. And I think Laura Maudman, the learning pirate, says it nicely. If your brain is a Ferrari, you wouldn't put bad fuel in it. It's just not going to run. And I think that's really the thing that you should think about. Avoid foods that are not good for you, because it will inhibit your learning. I don't think there's a miracle. Athletics greens isn't going to make you a really good learner, because it doesn't things.
Well, I've not noticed a direct uptake on that yet. I've been trying it for about 2 weeks, so maybe it just takes a bit longer to offset all the bad food before that.
There is something around not eating. So I think when you talk about diet full stop and learning, it's a very contentious issue. But I've been talking to someone who had some issues with focus and concentration, some issues around ADHD. And one of the things that she has been doing is not eating before a bout of learning. And so some of the science behind that is that, we do need food, we need glucose for our brain, but it also food, especially a lot of it, puts you into a parasympathetic state. You feel very relaxed, which is, it might seem a good idea for learning, but isn't the best. So what she's done is that when she does her learning, so I think the learning's in the morning, she uses some of the ultradian timings. She doesn't eat, so she doesn't eat till about 11 o'clock. And she likes the clarity of mind that kind of mini fast gives her. So that's an interesting thing around diet.
Yeah. Again, like you said, it just comes back to testing this out for yourself and seeing how it works for you. I guess the last part of the equation, because we're coming to time, is very quickly exercise. So I think most people know that exercise releases sort of chemicals in your brain, dopamine, serotonin, that makes it easier to focus. But what I didn't realize until I think it was one of your videos I was watching, that it can improve things like our reaction time for a period after we do it. It can also improve our ability to function. In the longer term, it can improve our capacity for memory. So just talk to us a little bit about how useful exercise is for learning.
Yeah, so if you really want to check this out, Wendy Suzuki is the person to go and check out for exercise and learning. She's done so much research in this area, and she explains it beautifully that when you do even a single bout of exercise, it's like giving your brain a bubble bath of neurotransmitters. So I think you mentioned a few there: dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and these are all involved. These neurochemicals all help to give you focus and concentration. We talked about how important that is, and you mentioned about the reaction time as well, but also it's really good in the long term as well, because what happens is, especially if you do a cardiorespiratory exercise to get the heart going for 30 minutes at a time, cycling, running, things like that. What it does, it helps birth hippocampal cells in the hippocampus in the brain. And one of the things that's really good about that is it helps with your focus. So there are some really good short-term benefits. So the workout will give you a dopamine boost. It will give you, which will last, I think Wendy Suzuki said, about 120 minutes after that particular bout of exercise. So that's a great period of time to then go off and do some focused work or go and do some learning. And then there's the long-term benefits as well. There's benefits to the prefrontal cortex as well, along with the hippocampus. And there's also benefits, protective benefits as well, that go kind of deeper into life. So exercise is fantastic for learning. Sleep, exercise, and diet, the triad, the really important three. You get to go and explore those three things. I think they're really, really important.
Yeah, awesome. I just have one final question for you, Carl, and it's about how we can interpret future research independently. So now, I'm sure you won't mind us all DMing you when we see an interesting piece of research and we say, Carl, how can we translate this to what we do every day? But do you have any sort of tips for if we do come across some sort of scientific paper or some findings and we want to take those away and apply them to L&D? Any sort of tips on how we can do that? I would try and, you can get, the thing with this scientific papers, there's a skill to reading them. That skill involves, for some people, a lot of coffee and a lot of preparation to be sent down lots of different avenues. If you ever read a scientific paper, it references other scientific papers, so you go off and off and off and off. What I tend to do is, especially if you're doing this in the first instance, is try and stick to learning science translators. So there's a whole group of people out there. I've mentioned some of their names. Andrew Huberman is one. Laura Maudman is another who I mentioned, the Learning Pirate. There's some really great, and Barbara Oakley, who we talked about, fantastic learning science translators.
some are more into doing a podcast or a blog, so you can follow them on an ongoing basis. And you can also search within what they've got in order to get an understanding of a particular concept. So I use learning science translators a lot in order to kind of get my head around a particular concept. So find your research, you go, oh, I think that's kind of interesting. I'll go on to someone like Clark Quinn. He's a great learning science translator. I go onto his blog and I'll do a search for that concept and see what he's got to say about it. So I kind of do a peer review, kind of review of that particular piece of science with a number of different learning science translators. And then if you really want to know if a particular piece of science stands up well, then Miriam Nealon and Paul Kirshner's blog is a great place to start. They talk a lot about evidence and making sure that a claim is well evidenced. And they've got some quite good tools there just to make sure that that particular piece of research you're looking at has had a big enough group within it, has had enough rigor. So all of those kind of things that you really want to look out for on a piece of scientific.
Perfect. I might get you to just send over that list and I'll put them all in the post-show summary so people can curate a good news feed on LinkedIn and wherever else they get content of useful people. Speaking of finding useful people, go on, Carl.
I was just going to say one other thing. You've got to find the scientific papers in the first place.
Yeah.
They're often behind paywalls, but the nicest place to start really is Google Scholar.
Okay.
It's a really good place to just go. For example, today we've talked about spaced repetition. Put spaced repetition into Google Scholar and see what it pulls out. It'll pull out some really old stuff and some newer stuff. So be aware that science is really liquid and it changes a lot over time. So you might read something and someone might say, you need to do this like this in order to, make the most of this particular strategy. Just spend some time making sure that some of that thinking is as up to date as possible. I've been called out a few times by scientists who have said, you're telling people stuff which is slightly out of date. You need to update that.
Yeah.
Just be aware of that.
Yeah. Try and see if it's the most recent research on that topic. Carl, we've come to time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned a lot personally, and I hope everyone else has as well. The beautiful thing about your brand is that you are Carl Learns everywhere. There is no Carl Learns 1, Carl Learns 2, Carl Learns _. So if anyone wants to find you, they can just look for Carl Learns on YouTube, LinkedIn. Obviously, your website is carllearns.com. Anything I missed on where people can find you?
No, that's it. Yeah, just search for Carl Learns in Google. You'll find my YouTube channel and my website. And I mainly hang out on LinkedIn, and I post a lot of stuff on LinkedIn. So that's feel free to connect. Anyone here connect or follow me, whatever works for you.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Carl.